When I joined, as employee number 2, we were working with, I think, 5 properties. Fast forward to today, we work with 2,000 properties.
Well, folks, welcome back to another episode of the VRNation station, your podcast for the short-term rental folks out there. I really do hope that folks are enjoying the podcast. If you have any comments, thoughts, please feel free to send the comments in. Like, subscribe, send smoke signals, however it fits. It would be terrific. I'd like to know that. I know people are looking. We just hit 7,000 views, which is great since this is now our 20th podcast. I'd say that's doing pretty good, which means people care and they care about the topic. So I'm happy about that. I do want to introduce a new friend of mine, Sebastian Munoz, and I know I butchered that a little bit, from Angel Host. Sebastian is a breath of fresh air. I have talked with a lot of folks over the years, specific around things like revenue management and systems and technology. And Sebastian has a very non-traditional way of looking at revenue management, which I think is really good. So Sebastian, maybe introduce yourself and tell the folks a little bit about Angel Host.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jamie. Yeah, I'm Sebastian with Angel Host. I've been with Angel Host over the last close to 8 years now. Angel Host is a company that does revenue management and listing optimization as a service. We started with a handful of properties when I joined, as employee number 2. We were working with, I think, 5 properties. Fast forward to today, we work with 2,000 properties across 60 different cities around the world, and essentially helping property management companies and operators maximize revenue with their portfolios through connecting the dots between the pricing side of things and the listing performance and searchability side of things.
Excellent. Well, that's great. So I'm of limited revenue management technology experience because we are at Cabino. We are a streamlined company, and we've been working with RevMax. Not that the folks at RevMax aren't fine and the technology works well, but I do run into some stuff from time to time where I just kind of head scratch a little bit. So how does Angel Host set itself aside from like a RevMax or Wheelhouse or any of its other competitors?
It's a great question, and I always like to start by putting the foundation of like what's out there in terms of the provider landscape. So you see companies like Price Labs, Wheelhouse, Beyond, RevMax. These are all great tools, and we don't see ourselves as being in competition with them because these are planes essentially. These are tools that someone has to use, and sure, some of them are plain SaaS only, right? So let's say Price Labs, they're going to give you the tool, and it's fully up to you to manage it. And maybe there's going to be consultants or account managers that come with it. And then there's going to be other tools where, like, let's say Beyond, RevMax, they might give you a little bit more of a hands-on, let's say, consulting to it. But it's still the case that it's up to someone from the property management company to do the heavy lifting. Sure, you're going to get some insights, some inputs, some suggestions, but it's mostly going to be similar to what a consultant would do. They tell you what to do, and then they give you accountability, and then they wish you good luck, which works great for people that have that bandwidth to do revenue management in-house, that have that interest to keep it something that they do in-house. There are property management companies that just don't have that that capacity to handle this in-house, and where they would much rather have someone do it fully for them. And I think that's where Angel Host steps in, not as a plane, not as a better plane, but rather as an aggregator of multiple different planes, right? Because there's dynamic pricing as a plane or as a technology tool, right? There's also listing optimization tools that are coming out. There's market data tools that are specific to that. So right there, you're talking three technology categories. You're talking three different planes, the dynamic pricing, the market data, and the listing optimization software. But then, even if you have the best plane in the world, you need the pilot, you need the human being that's going to be coming in and making those adjustments. And that's Angel Host. It's a combination of, working with what we think are the best planes out there. Also we've developed some of our own technology that sits on top of these dynamic pricing tools that are out there. But then more importantly, we bring in the human expertise to actually, do the setups, make sure that we are not just telling you what to do and wishing you good luck, but actually doing it for you on an ongoing basis, reporting performance to you, and really taking care of revenue management and listing optimization as a function.
Is that the last
not just
mile
advice,
that
but
we're
also
talking about? I mean, so I see the last mile of pricing. And again, it's funny. So I'm blessed. I have a revenue manager I work with. And when you talk about what Angel Host does, I visualize it because I realize how spoiled I am, because I have somebody to go, why is that priced like that? Right. And then it's like, well, this is why it's priced like this. Last year it was priced like this. 2 years ago it was this. Demand looks like this. The marketplace looks like that. And I think it's really a great call out is that, when you talk about the tools and the technology, and I see this across the board, unfortunately. And if I had to put a wrapper around it, short-term property management folks, midterms as well, long terms as well. It's just any property manager. Pricing is such a it's an unfortunate last step in a lot of times in their process, right? Because you got people that are worried about what kind of sheets are we using? Are we, how are we cleaning? What kind of cleansers are we using? Like, is the property perfect? Is the, is it safe? Is it, can people trust us? Do we have a level of security? And when it comes down to pricing, what I see is they go out and this is for my friends out in the audience that have 2 to 3, potentially up to 5 properties. If you don't have a pricing strategy, right, you don't have someone like Sebastian, it's really tough because the first thing you do is you go, oh, well, let me look for some comps because Airbnb has a comp tool, right? VRBO has a comp tool. And then you go price it to what you think the comps are. Is that right? Is that wrong? That's a great question, Sebastian. What would be the difference between me using a comp tool out of Airbnb to set my pricing versus somebody from Angel Host? Like, how would you do it differently?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think when you talk about competitive sets, there's a lot to break down there, because the first thing is setting up the right competitive set to begin with, right? Making sure that you are broad enough for you to see, what's the difference between a pricing that's at the highest percentile, something that's expensive versus something that's, cheap, right? So you want your competitive set to be broad enough, but you also want it to be specific enough to where it's relevant to, making sure that you are comparing yourself with properties that you actually compete with, right? So when you just set up a competitive set, the mistake that we see a lot of people make is they will just kind of base themselves on the list of properties that the tool will recommend as a competitive set, right? They won't go in and make the adjustments. By adjustments, I mean, excluding the properties that are inactive. For example, going in and seeing, is there a property here that is part of my default competitive set, but once I go in and I see, the calendar, for example, it's actually fully blocked. So it's something that I might want to just exclude, because the data might be skewed there, because it might be showing 100% occupancy rate when in reality we know that's not the case. What if you see that the last review of the listing took place 12 months ago, right? And so is it really an active listing when you don't see a consistent kind of volume of reviews happening, on a certain time horizon? There's that as well to take into consideration. Do you see pricing that is super high or super low? Do you see outliers when it comes to pricing as part of that competitive set that you're going to want to exclude? So these are all things that go into it. when setting up the competitive set. So don't just go with, whatever default list of competitors, whatever dynamic pricing tool you use might be recommending. Really go in and filter it out. You also want to look into excluding people that don't have pricing that is dynamic enough, right? If you see properties where their pricing doesn't fluctuate that much, why would you want to be comparing yourself necessarily versus those folks when you are actually a professional operator that has a proper pricing strategy in place? You might want to not let yourself be fooled by the fact that, the person that doesn't know anything about revenue management is pricing this property at 600 a night. Being priced at a certain price point doesn't mean that you get booked at a certain price point. So that's really the first thing that Angel Host does is making sure that we build a proper competitive set.
Sure.
And then once we do that, the second biggest mistake we see people make is that they will just set it up once and they'll leave it there. So for example, let's say that you have a property that is more on the luxury side. It's a brand new property, high-end amenities, whatever that might be. And then you're setting up your pricing, and you decide that you want to be at the 90th percentile, right? You want to be at the expensive side of things versus your market. And then you can leave it there, right? But what happens is you're going to have pricing that is dynamic, that fluctuates, but always fluctuates at the top, right? And the reality is, as much as you might have the nicest property, you're always competing in the OTAs with the next available alternative, right? So the moment that you get a bad review, the moment that the actual performance is telling you that you're not getting bookings at a fast enough booking velocity, the moment that the actual performance is telling you that you're pacing behind last year, that is where you got to go in and you got to reposition yourself. You got to rethink where you want to be at versus the market. Maybe you started at a 90th percentile, but maybe the moment you got a bad review and that booking velocity started to be affected, you're going to want to go in and want to drop that even further, right? The 90th percentile. So I think there's two things there, filtering the data properly rather than just trusting the comp set that the tool throws at you. And number two, repositioning yourself versus that comp set in terms of where you want to be pricing wise versus that comp set based on the actual performance data as you get it, which is more important in a lot of cases than the actual comp set itself that you started with.
So how much do you trust the data that you're seeing on that comp set? I mean, that's where I run into some hurdles. I try to build some comp sets. I've done bedroom-based comp sets. I've done amenity-based concepts. And, again, it's like where I run into problems is that there's a good number of people, right? And I've got some good friends of mine I've had on the podcast that I'm going to have on the podcast that talk about booking direct, right? So think of like the Jen Boyles and the Frank Bosies and people like that who are really, they're really focusing on book direct strategies. Well, book direct is not in lieu of revenue management. It is a complementor to revenue management. So when I look at competition, I don't know who's doing more solid booking like direct marketing. Cabino, for example, is in Eastern Idaho. It's a very religious area. So we get a lot of our guests are LDS folks coming up from Salt Lake City in Utah. And oftentimes you'll have people that are marketing through the church, so to speak. And so it's really hard to even get in competition with those. Do you include those as your comp set, or do you exclude those as your comp set?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think, it's true that most dynamic pricing tools out there will scrape primarily OTA data, potentially leaving behind, as to your point, anything that might be direct bookings for those comparables, right? So there's a few things there. Number one is having multiple data sources, not just trusting one single data source. So this goes back to having multiple planes, right? So you have different data tools that will obtain their data in a different way, right? So you have data tools that scrape, but you also have data tools that go directly to the source because they're connected, at a PMS level. And so in markets where there are enough people utilizing that tool, in a way where it's getting the data directly from the PMS, you can trust the data a little bit more, in the sense that at least you're not going just based on, kind of like scrape data from the OTAs. You're going based on actual bookings from the source, which is the PMS, which, as you know, the PMS centralizes, the data, for all the sources of bookings. So, that should consider direct bookings as well. But really more important than that is, I think, not thinking that because you don't have a perfect competitive set, you are not able to do revenue management. And I think sometimes I see people getting too caught up in trying to have a perfect competitive set. That kind of misses the point, because going back to what I was saying earlier, the second element to it is the actual measuring of the performance. And I think that's even more important than having the perfect competitive set, because if you are measuring your own performance, if you know what your booking velocity is, if you know how you're pacing versus last year today and versus last year final, if you have historical data for your own property, you will be able to make adjustments to the pricing and manual overrides to the pricing that are much more relevant than if you were just trying to only focus on the comp set. So I see the comp set as kind of like a starting, way of getting kind of like a direction and a sense of where you're at versus, where you want to be at versus what's available out there. But I don't necessarily see it as, the most important thing to be basing yourself on in order to make manual overrides. Again, we could talk about some of those KPIs, but pacing, for example, I would say it's even more important than, your comp set when it comes to deciding whether you should, decrease prices or increase prices versus what the dynamic pricing tool is suggesting. Because again, if you are doing worse than last year today, if your future months look less booked in terms of occupancy than last year today, it can mean one of two things, right? Either A, booking windows are getting shorter, right? And we are seeing that in a lot of markets. People are booking more last minute, so that could be it. And so you could decide, okay, it's just booking windows getting shorter. I'm just going to hold my rates high, right? Because I trust that the occupancy will come. It will just come a little bit later. Or the other thing it can be is not only booking windows are shorter, but also there's going to be less demand at the end. And if that's the case, you want to kind of decide that that's your hypothesis before it's too late.
So
Because
what
if
do
you
you
wait to the
look at
very,
for
very last
determining
minute,
that though, right? Because so this is the crystal ball question. I mean, okay, yeah, you're right. It's either windows are shorter, right? Which they've been collapsing ever since I started in this industry. I mean, they can't get any shorter. And then ideally, and now it's like, well, then demand's going down. So what's the crystal ball you're looking at to determine which of those two factors it is? I mean, it's no different than like stock market, buy or sell. How long are you going to hold? Are you going to hold and then sell late? What's your crystal ball? What do you look at that tells you whether it should be lowered or to sustain?
Yeah, to be clear, there's no crystal ball, but there's a few things you can look at, right? For example, have the previous months ended at occupancy levels that were lower than the previous year? That already is an indication that if your future months are looking like they are less booked than last year, and your past months have closed at occupancy levels that are lower than last year, well, there's a good chance that that trend might continue. So that's one, right? The other one, that also you want to be keeping an eye on is just booking velocity, right? Are you getting booked at a faster pace? Like how many bookings you're getting, let's say, per week or per day, right? And is that slowing down or is that increasing, right? That might also be an indication of whether you need to increase or decrease your prices further. And then there's a few other benchmarks that we really like to keep an eye on. Market penetration index is another one that we really like. So when we divide, kind of your occupancy versus the market's occupancy rate, it's either going to give us an index that's higher than one or lower than one. Higher than one, it means that we are outperforming the market in terms of occupancy. Lower than one, we're underperforming the market in terms of occupancy. But you don't always want to be outperforming or underperforming necessarily the same way. So let me give you an example. If you're looking at a far out high season, so large booking window, and we're talking about a high season, if you saw a market penetration index of 1.7, meaning you're outperforming the market by 70% in terms of occupancy, that would be a big red flag, because why are you booked so much
fast
versus the market so fast for a far out high season? But the opposite is also true. If you see 1.7 for a far out low season, that might make sense, because the rule of thumb is you want to be one of the first ones to book that far out low season, but one of the last ones to book that that high season, right? So these are, again, no crystal ball whatsoever, but really it's just a series of KPIs and benchmarks that you can use to keep a pulse on how things are doing. And this KPIs are gonna give you, they're gonna give you something to reflect on, and also by combining what the data is telling you with kind of like your own macro understanding of what's happening with the economy, and with tariffs, and with international travel demand in general, which is something that being present in 60 different cities around the world really gives us as a unique perspective. You can then kind of make your own decisions as to whether it's just booking window or whether it's actual demand that's going to end up potentially at a lower level.
Got it. So again, I'm spoiled, right? So I have access to a lot of this data, and some of our listeners are newer, right? So these are newer folks. They're just getting in. They might not have historical data to depend on, right? So before I pivot to the listing onboard stuff, what would be your top 3 things for a new property manager to focus on with what they have in their hands? Like, where would they get the data? What should they look at? And what's the smart move from setting that pricing?
Mm-hmm. Well, for someone that might be starting, what I would say is focusing on quality of the operation, even though it's not related to revenue management, is really the most important thing. Because if you have a good operation with good reviews, it will be so much easier to do a good job at revenue management than if you don't have good reviews and good listings. So especially if you're starting out and you're not a pro at at revenue management or wanting to become a pro at it, just having amazing reviews is really going to help, right? From there, assuming you have a good operation, you have good reviews, you want to move into, well, having a dynamic pricing tool, of course, is a given. Anyone listening should have a dynamic pricing tool. I would only just be aware of thinking that the dynamic pricing tool is a set it and forget it type of
Right.
thing, and really keep an eye on it. And there's multiple ways to do this, but one of the ones I've heard recently that I find interesting is having basically this understanding of your prime booking window. So how far in advance does most of your demand come, and how does that change from 1 month to the next? If you can understand that, which most dynamic pricing tools will provide as far as data, you're going to be ahead of a lot of people, because how far in advance most people book kind of gives you like a calendar understanding of when should you start to worry about having booked or not having booked a given a given day, right? Because I see a lot of people just going based on the average yearly booking window. So people, let's say, book, I don't know, 10 days in advance on average during the year. So I'm always going to be trying to be booked 10 days in advance. Well, if we take that to the next level, what's the booking window? What's the advance notice? What's the anticipation period? So how far in advance do you normally see 50% of your bookings there. So if you understand that, that kind of gives you like a milestone to work towards. So, if that's, let's say 20 days out, so 20 days out for, January or whatever, normally I have achieved 50% occupancy. Well, if I'm not at 50% occupancy by 20 days out, that gives me something very tangible that tells me, I gotta go in and adjust something because I'm not at that level. So that would be one of the things I would suggest at a very basic level, in terms of, understanding when should you start worrying, because that's one of the most important responsibilities of any revenue manager, is making sure that you don't discount too early, but making sure that you don't discount too late
Right.
either. So
Right.
this booking window based approach to it is a good way to start. And then the third thing is caring about your listing, right? Making sure that you understand that not everything in this life can be solved by pricing, but really listing performance has a lot to do with it, and we can get more into that. But going back to the pricing thing, one extra thing I would add is make sure that you control your prices. And what I mean by that is, if you're a property management company, you work with owners who set the rates, that is a recipe for failure, because the owner doesn't know how to set rates properly. The owner is too emotionally attached to the property to set rates properly. And so if you are starting out and you are taking your first management contracts and owners, trying to set that expectation, from the get-go, that, hey, if you're working with me as a management company, you're going to trust my pricing recommendations as much as possible. So many property management companies I speak with say that, they really change how much, flexibility they allow owners to have, or how much input they allow owners to have with their rates as they've grown. So the more that you can do that sooner rather than later, the better. Because keep in mind, as a property management company, you make a commission on, the bookings that you generate. You can have the most beautiful property in the world. If the owner doesn't let you price competitively, that property won't book, and therefore you won't make money as a property manager, and you still need to pay your fixed costs and
Right.
everything regarding your tech stack and whatnot. So being super, super thoughtful about what a pricing, what a pricing minimum is, what should be that minimum rate, and trying to, as much as possible, have it be a price that you decide as a property manager, as opposed to letting the owner decide what that price should be.
Got it. No, and that makes a ton of sense. And yeah, it's funny. So like really the three things is going to be understanding your booking windows. You got to understand the booking windows. That's critical to understand whether you're ahead or behind, or you're over or you're underpriced. Like what's your pace, your booking pace. And then two, if I understood it correctly, is really taking a look at the listing quality, right? Making sure that, and same with like reviews and operations, like you've got to have a saleable product, right? Pricing is not going to solve the fact that you're trying to overprice a tin shack. It just doesn't work that way. Like you've got to take care of that property. You've got to have good reviews, which brings me to a whole nother concept I'll talk about when we get to listing onboarding. But then, and then, lastly, just ensuring that, you're using that dynamic tool, that you're really understanding where you can make your adjustments and when, and what the expectation should be. And that's kind of fits in with the homeowner. So folks, that's really, really important information. If you don't have access to the tools, right, there are ways for you to manually figure this stuff out. But just understanding what Sebastian, what you're saying, I think is really a critical step for anybody that's in the property management space, especially if they're newer or if they have fewer properties and they're kind of realizing like they've got to understand that competitive landscape quite a bit. Now, you made a comment to me when we were just chatting, and I thought it was interesting, and it fits right now, which is never let your owner set the floors. You made that comment to me, and you said we'd circle back. So I want to circle back to that because I have some super owners. They're terrific people. I love it. But when you just talked about the emotional connection, I thought that that was something worth diving into, because the reality is I have owners that are quite unhappy because they're like, you are not, yeah, I mean, you are just giving my property away. And it's like, well, not really.
Hmm.
So maybe talk
Hmm.
about that a little bit. I think that's a good topic to maybe brief on.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I think the first thing that is important to understand is that we need to speak the same language. And by speaking the same language, with the owners, I mean measuring success in the same way, right? If the owner thinks that success equals having the highest price, then we're not speaking the same language, right? Because as long as they don't see that that price is going up, they're going to consider whatever you're doing as a failure, right? So I think the first step is, hey, we don't care about ADR as a standalone metric, because you can have the best, most beautiful price in the world and be empty. We don't care about occupancy as a standalone metric, because you could have 100% occupancy rate and be giving away your property for free, right? So we care about revenue. We care about yearly revenue, more specifically. Starting there, I think it's very important. And I know for anyone that's listening to this, that runs properties, that is an operator, this is obvious to some degree, but sometimes it's not as obvious when you're really trying to understand why an owner is upset. You kind of get to the understanding that, hey, they're upset because they thought that in order to increase revenue you had to increase price. And some owners truly believe this. They want to make more revenue, and therefore they say, hey, increase my price, which in their head is going to lead to more revenue, right? And to be fair, there are times when the move is to increase price, and when you're pacing well and your booking velocity is good and you have amazing reviews, and all of those things, and you're in the high season and you've done a good job at being competitive, during the shoulder low season. That is the time when you're going to be able to increase prices further than what the dynamic pricing tool is suggesting. Whenever that's not the case, whenever you're looking at a very challenging market, maybe a market where inventory growth has been faster than demand growth, maybe, again, a property that's pacing behind last year that just got a bad review, well, increasing the price won't lead to more revenue. It's the opposite. It's decreasing the price that will lead to you getting more nights sold, that will lead to, as an aggregate during the year, ending up with more revenue. The question becomes, where do you draw the line and what that minimum should be, right? And I think there's two sides to this conversation. In a way, I find that a lot of the things in this industry are always either on the emotional side or the logical side. So on the emotional side, you have the debate of, well, less than this price point, I'm going to get the type of guests that I don't want to have in my property. They're going to destroy the property. They're not going to care for it. They're going to damage it. The wear and tear is going to be too large, which I would challenge, right? Because we have done some interesting correlation analysis. So what we did is we took 13,000 reservations that resulted in about 200 claims for property damage. And then we took those 200 claims for property damage and we asked ourselves the question, is it true that the people that paid less cost more damage, right? And the way we went about answering that question is we looked at those 200 claims for property damage and we saw at what price point, that they were booked. And one of two things could be the case. It was either booked at a price point that was higher than the property's ADR or lower than the property's ADR. And what we saw is that 65% of the reservations that had resulted in a claim for property damage had a price point that was higher than the property's ADR. So, in other words, the majority of the reservations that resulted in a claim for property damage, it wasn't people that had paid less. It was actually people that had paid more, right? So again, I think we all anecdotally remember that one guest that paid a little and destroyed the property, and that's kind of what we keep in mind. But if you just, I would invite you to do this analysis in your own portfolio, and maybe you're going to find out that in your case there is a true correlation between renting for less and having property damage. But what we found with a representative enough sample size of 13,000 reservations was that there was not such a correlation, meaning there is a risk to this industry, which is getting property damage, and that risk exists whether you book for more or whether you book for less. So that's number one. That's number one thing to keep in mind. Being competitive doesn't mean you're going to necessarily get the bad kind of guests. It is a risk, it is a cost of doing business, and it can happen as much if it's expensive as much as if it's low. Now, on the other side, there's how low the price should be for the owner to see a break even. And this is super important because sometimes owners will say, oh, less than 300 a night, I lose money, right? And property managers will just trust that the property owner did their calculation properly, and that they did their math, and you'll set the price minimum at 300. What we've seen, and we actually built a calculator. It's a minimum rate calculator. It's a free resource, by the way. I'm happy to put the link out there if ever anyone wants to play with this minimum rate calculator. The idea is you input as an owner or as a property manager that's going through this exercise on behalf of an owner. You input your fixed costs of owning your property, right? So anything that's fixed, whether it's HOA fees or there's rent or mortgage or internet, whatever is fixed that you have to pay for regardless of whether you book or not, that is number one thing that you input. And what we need to understand is that whether you book or not, there's a cost to owning your property, even if you were empty. So you need to know what that cost is. Once you know what that cost is, what we add to that is the cost of getting an extra booking. So there's an extra cost. There's the variable cost of getting an extra booking. So what is the portion of the cleaning fee that's not paid for by the cleaning fee that the guest pays, that the owner needs to absorb? What's the let's say the welcome kit, the little things we might give to the guests when they arrive. All of those things we only need to pay for if we get an extra booking. And what we need to understand is that as long as we break even on the variable cost of getting an extra booking, any dollar that you get on top of the variable cost is going to help to cover for fixed costs that otherwise would have had to be paid for out of pocket. So the owner needs to understand you have two options here if we're looking at how competitive we need to be. You either pay for your fixed costs 100% out of pocket, which is what's going to happen if you stay empty, or even if you don't recuperate 100% of your fixed costs, partial fixed cost recovery is better than zero fixed cost recovery. And it's through those incremental nights that are profitable that we essentially get to accumulate, incremental revenue throughout the year. And as long as we're measuring success as revenue and not measuring success as rate or as occupancy, as long as we're measuring it as revenue, we will be speaking the same language, and we'll be in a position to be competitive and maximize performance.
That makes sense. That's interesting. And we're running a little short on time. I think you had a hard stop on it. But one thing that I wanted to say, because we didn't get to the listing onboarding piece, which I'd love to come back to. But one of the points that I've found is when I sell properties for a lower price, and I've had conversations with homeowners, and what I found is that it actually manipulates the algorithm. The Airbnb VRBO, any of the OTAs, they realize like if all of a sudden I've booked it on VRBO, Airbnb is gonna boost my listing to try and get it sold on, because they see each other as this property is selling, so there's demand for this product. And what I try to explain to people is like, sometimes we have to lower the price just to get activity on the other marketplaces. Have you seen that? Like, is that something that you guys use as a strategy?
Not so much just for the sake of waking up the algorithm, because I think that what we've seen is that the algorithm in terms of ranking really cares about two things, which are conversion rate and probability of getting a 5-star review. And so, Airbnb said it themselves at their host summit in San Francisco at their headquarters. So it's true that when you are competitive, you convert more. So indirectly, lowering your rate can lead to a higher conversion rate, which can lead to you ranking higher. But I think it's a misconception, to think that it's the actual thing itself that you change, whether it's the price or whether it's the photo, that is making the algorithm wake up and put you higher in the search results. It's just that all of those changes that you make at the listing level might end up increasing your conversion rate or decreasing your conversion rate, which will then result in you ranking higher or lower, because that's what the OTAs care about, is making sure that if they show you somewhere in the first page of search results, that you're going to get clicks, and that once you get a click, you're going to get a booking. And going back to the direct booking conversation, sometimes what I see as a downside of trying to get bookings to convert through your direct booking website, to begin with, the challenge with that approach is that you're telling the OTA that your booking didn't convert, even though you got the booking, because maybe the person went into your direct booking website after having inquired on Airbnb, and maybe you made it easy for them to find you online by putting your company name up everywhere, and maybe giving them little hints and whatnot that, like, you can offer better prices directly. Sure, you won, you got the booking, the guest won, they got a better deal, but your listing lost. Because now your listing, what your listing feels is, I got a click, but I didn't get a booking, because the listing doesn't know that you got the booking directly. So I'm all for direct bookings, don't get me wrong. I think that you either want to have your own sources of direct bookings that go directly into your website through SEO, PPC, whatever that might be, or you want to retarget people that stayed, that came from the OTA, and try to get them to book directly. I would highly discourage people from trying to take people that went into the OTA and then take them to book direct instead.
Yeah, because it does punish you, I think, from an algorithm perspective, for sure.
I don't think I hear you.
Oh, you didn't hear me?
Oh, I think I lost you there.
Oh, no. Can you hear me now? It must be your audio, because I can see it's recording on the podcast software.
Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I can see your voice is coming through. So I'm not sure if it's something
see.
with your.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, it must have been something with your audio.
No worries.
Okay, well, excellent. I know you do have a hard stop in a couple minutes, so what we can do is we can just put a wrapper on it, and we'll just figure it out from there. Does that work?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, for sure.
Awesome.
If you want to wrap it up, for sure.
Yeah, you have a hard stop at 2, right?
Yeah.
Or 2 Central, I should say. All right. Well, folks, again, Sebastian, thanks so much for joining the podcast. I feel like I could probably sit here and talk to you for a couple more hours. I know you got a hard stop, and I think that this has been a really great conversation in regards to pricing strategy and revenue management. There's so much more, folks, when it comes to listings and your experience and just how you price this stuff. It really can be a make or break for you. So I really would encourage you, if you're not sure, reach out to Sebastian and Angel Host, get a meeting set up, have them just talk to you about, what they can do. It really does make a big difference. And again, for folks that haven't been a part of VRNation, we would love to have you join us. This type of conversation and association, these friendships that I have formed with folks really comes as a huge benefit as being a member of VRNation. So please, if you're not a member, join. If you can make it to the conference, great. It's a blast. I'll see you there. If you can't, come to one of the local or regional conferences that we put on in your area. We do several all over the country. And again, this is why we try to set up property managers new and old for success by introducing folks like Sebastian. So Sebastian, thanks again. I appreciate having you.
Thanks so much, Jamie. And if anyone wants the minimum rate calculator, they can find it in our website, myangelhost.com. We also offer a free listing performance audit there. You can put in your listing. We'll give it a score out of 100 and give you some free feedback on what you could do to improve. Thanks again, Jamie. It was a great conversation. Really enjoyed it. And we'll see each other soon at VRNation.
Excellent. Thanks again. Goodbye, everyone. Have a great day.
Welcome y'all to the VRNation station. We're diving deep into vacation rental sensations. From management tips to the latest creation, join us each week for some sparkle and conversation. VRNation station, tune in and feel the thrill.